I'm going to jump right in, and we're just going to go for it here. And as a lifelong economic professor, one of the hazards is that you can become long-winded, and I'm going to try and get through things quickly and not get too bogged down, and that we can have half an hour or more for Q&A and back and forth about all this. So there's the plan. Well, it is 2023, and we socialists have been talking about an alternative to capitalism for, it's over 200 years now. And beginning in 1917 in the Soviet Union, there have been numerous attempts in many different countries to create socialist economies, all of which have failed, more or less miserably, to live up to expectations. I tried to phrase that very carefully. So what I want to talk about is, what are the important lessons we've learned? In particular, what should we be at pains to avoid? And what kinds of things should we not be proposing? So as Sandy said, I'm one of the co-creators of one answer to these questions. There are other people who've attempted to answer these questions and have various models that they are proposing at this point in time. So I am the co-creator of one of the attempts to answer these questions. So this talk's divided into some parts, and the first part is just going to give you a quick run through of the essential features of our proposal, which we call a participatory economy. I think many early socialists, including Marx, believed that once workers wrested what they called the means of production from the clutches of capitalists, workers would prove capable of planning together how to put them to good use, and that they would do that democratically and fairly. And of course they would want to do it efficiently. Why would they want to waste their own work? What I've come to understand now is that a great deal of the devil can be in the details. But I'm more convinced than ever that this can be done. And therefore, to continue to allow markets to coordinate our interconnected activities inefficiently and unfairly, while inflicting unsustainable damage on the natural environment, or to empower some planning authority to coordinate this on our behalf. That neither of those is necessary, and what we now know is that to proceed along either of those routes is very unwise. I think the most important contribution that those of us who advocate for the model of a participatory economy have made to the debate is to offer a concrete explanation for how you can reconcile comprehensive economic planning with an appropriate degree of autonomy for workers in their workplaces and consumers in their neighborhoods. And I'm more convinced than ever that failure to figure out how to reconcile those two things really was the Achilles heel of historic attempts to build socialism during the 20th century. When I study those attempts, and many mistakes were made, many things went wrong, many extenuating circumstances. But I think if there was one part of the project that really proved to be the Achilles heel of 20th century socialism, it was a failure to reconcile comprehensive democratic decision-making with an appropriate degree of autonomy for people in their workplaces and neighborhoods. So over the past 3 decades, and most recently fully in parts 3 and 4 of a book called Democratic Economic Planning, published by Routledge in 21, I try to explain in detail how annual participatory planning, investment planning, and long-run development planning might be conducted without markets, without a central authority, in a way that allows workers in consumer councils and federations to manage themselves, but in socially responsible ways, to achieve outcomes which are fair, efficient, and environmentally sustainable. This slide basically sort of gives you a picture of what the big alternatives are. I mean, the first is a market system. In this case, Wall Street means it's a market capitalist system. And then, of course, in the Soviet Union for decades and decades, we had a central planning authority and a very authoritarian political system administering the economy. Briefly, during the Spanish Revolution in the 1930s, there was a different kind of planning that went on in Catalonia, which I do think at least showed us the beginnings of a vision of something quite different from these other approaches. That is more or less the kind of thing that we need to build upon. This slide gives you some idea of the moving parts. We have workers' councils, democratically functioning workers' councils, and then we have federations of workers' councils. We also have neighborhood consumer councils, which we federate into ward councils and then city councils. In the United States, would be state councils. And then we have an annual participatory planning procedure, and that's the thing I'm going to talk about first. Okay, participatory annual planning. First, let's figure out what the challenge is. How can we empower worker and consumer councils while protecting the interests of others in the economy who are affected by what these councils do? How can we give groups of workers what I would call user rights over part of society's productive commons, without allowing them to benefit unfairly from productive resources that belong to all of us? Now, I think socialists have long understood that what one group in an economy does will inevitably affect many others, and therefore that all should have a say regarding these economic decisions. That's something that socialists have been aware of and understood for a long time. But different economic decisions do not usually affect everyone to the same extent. How can we give people decision-making power to the degree they are affected by different economic decisions? How can we give workers and consumers in their councils an appropriate degree of autonomy over what they do? So in fact, that's the challenge that I accept when I'm trying to figure out how would you organize some sort of system of annual democratic planning. So here is just a really brief run through, because it's not difficult to describe the procedure, in its basic outlines. Prices are announced. We call them indicative prices. If I'm speaking to economists, I go, oh, these are estimates of opportunity costs and social costs. So we start with some sort of estimates. And these are announced by something, this is one of the jokes that we have amongst ourselves, and sometimes we have felicitous names for things, and sometimes we've chosen terribly clunky names. Well, an iteration facilitation board is one of those clunky names. But in any case, we have an iteration facilitation board which simply announced the current estimates of these opportunity costs. The opportunity costs of using all the different kinds of natural resources, the opportunity costs of using all the different categories of labor, and the opportunity cost of using capital goods, as well as current estimates of the social cost of producing all the goods and services produced in the economy. That's the first step. Iteration Facilitation Board announces those estimates. That's followed by proposals being made by both neighborhood consumer councils and worker councils. The neighborhood consumer councils, they respond by making consumption requests. And worker councils respond by making production proposals. In other words, what are the outputs that they want to produce, and what are the inputs that they want to ask the commission to use to do that? The third step is that the estimates of the opportunity and social costs get updated by this iteration facilitation board. All they have to do is they just add up all the demands and supplies for each final good, intermediate good, capital good, natural resource, category of labor, and then they adjust their estimate of its opportunity cost up or down in proportion to the degree to which in this round of planning there was either excess demand or excess supply. That's the annual planning procedure. This process is simply continued repeated until there's no longer excess demand or supply for any good or service, until there's what economists call a feasible plan. Now let's step back and start to think a little bit about what's going on. Who exactly is proposing what? And how are these proposals getting evaluated? Well, each round of this, I think of it as a social iterative procedure, is going to begin with new, more accurate estimates of opportunity and social costs. Now, is that something that you can just take on faith, or do you want somebody to prove it for you? You should demand that somebody prove it for you. And proving something means, well, you have to make certain assumptions. Well, I've done that. If you make very standard assumptions that economists make about technologies and preferences, under those standard assumptions, I can prove that these opportunity costs will converge and will be accurate. Each council has to revise and resubmit its own proposal for what it wants to do. It's not making a proposal about what it would like the entire economy to do or anybody else to do. It's just making a proposal about what they want to do. So they have to revise and resubmit until what? Until it meets with approval from the other councils and federations. There is no central authority with the power to approve, reject, or revise any council's proposal. Consumption council proposals, how are they going to be evaluated by the other councils and federations? Well, we're simply going to multiply the quantity of every good or service requested by the current estimate of its social cost of producing it, and we're going to compare that to the average effort rating plus allowances of the households in the consumption council making the request. Production council proposals from the worker councils are going to be evaluated by comparing the estimated social benefits of their outputs to the estimated social costs of using the inputs they request. Who's going to say no? Who's going to say a proposal is not socially responsible? It's not acceptable to the residents? Well, everyone could easily see if consumption council and worker council proposals are socially responsible. And that's what eliminates the need for a central authority to approve or disapprove these requests, much less revise them. Consumer councils requesting more than is warranted by their effort ratings and allowances, they're going to discover that they are forced to shift their request either to less socially costly items, or they're going to reduce the amounts they request overall. If what? If they expect to win approval from other councils. Worker councils whose outputs are less beneficial than the social cost of producing them, they're going to discover they're forced to shift toward producing either a more desirable mix of outlets or to a less socially costly mix of inputs, or they're going to have to increase their efforts if they expect to win approval for their proposals from other councils. Efficiency is promoted as consumers and workers attempt to shift their proposals in response to updated estimates of these opportunity and social costs. Equity is promoted when further shifting is insufficient to win approval from fellow consumers and workers, and therefore finally has to be achieved through consumption reduction or just greater work ethic. The key is if we provide councils with the information required to review one another's proposals literally at a glance, they should be quickly able to approve or disapprove each other's proposals as it's socially responsible. You want to do it, well, we can look and see that it's socially responsible. So fine, do it. Now look, of course there's going to be exceptions. And of course it's going to be important to design appeals procedures to handle unusual cases where literally the problem is the numbers line. The problem is that our best attempt to get completely accurate estimates of opportunity costs, they're going to be, sometimes we're going to be off. So of course we're going to have to be careful to design appeals procedures. But the information provided by this participatory planning procedure makes it possible for councils to approve or reject most proposals very, very quickly. Now I'll say a little bit about opportunity and social costs, and I know that most non-economists who believe in socialism is the last thing they want to hear about. But unfortunately they're important. No other proposal for how to conduct comprehensive democratic planning has successfully dealt with the problem of how to generate reasonably accurate estimates of the opportunity costs of using scarce productive inputs, be they different categories of labor, services from the natural environment, or stocks of capital goods. There are other models out there. And in my most recent book, I have an appendix where I review them, talk about the good parts. When I'm reviewing those other proposals, not a single one of those other models actually has come up with a way to reasonably accurately estimate these things. And my argument is that without these things, workers and consumers cannot do their own planning sensibly. No other proposal generates reasonably accurate estimates of the social costs of producing goods and services, including the cost of producing of emitting pollutants, and I want to talk about that in particular. In contrast, our proposals do generate reasonably accurate estimates of opportunity costs and social costs as worker and consumer councils and federations interact during a social iterative participatory planning procedure, which is very carefully designed to yield estimates that are as accurate as you could hope. This is important because without accurate estimates of opportunity and social costs, it's impossible to know how to allocate scarce productive resources efficiently. Economists readily acknowledge this. But I think what might be even more important is that without them, it's impossible for workers and consumers to participate sensibly in economic decision-making without undue imposition on their time. And I'm going to talk about that a little bit at length later. So I think one of the problems is that people who advocate for democratic socialism assume, without realizing it, that they would have people meeting, talking, and arguing just way beyond what any sensible person would want to do. Unless workers and consumers are provided with reasonably accurate estimates of opportunity and social costs, they can't even know if their own proposals are socially responsible. Much less can they quickly come to a decision about whether others are socially responsible. And most importantly, without reasonably accurate estimates of opportunity and social costs, nobody can know whether or not to approve or disapprove of what others are proposing to do. However, with that information, workers and consumer councils, I believe, can engage in socially responsible self-management. And they don't need a central authority to boss them around. They don't need market forces to coordinate all their interconnected activities. And it can be done without excessive burdens on their time. And that's what we've tried in a number of publications and a number of pieces of work and research we've carried out to try and demonstrate. Okay, I want to talk a little bit about protecting the environment. Bill Clinton, when he was running for election, I believe the first time, was famous for coming up with the phrase, "It's the economy, stupid." Well, leftist is the environment, stupid. Like most socialists, I came to environmental awareness belated, for which I apologize. But I've now been teaching environmental economics and publishing articles and books in that field for more than 2 decades. More to the point, I've now explained how to incorporate what economists call a pollution demand revealing mechanism into the participatory annual planning procedure. And gone to lengths to prove that under standard assumptions, this mechanism will achieve the following. It will reduce pollution to reasonably efficient levels. That is, it will allow emissions up to the point where the marginal social cost of emissions is equal to their marginal social benefit. It satisfies what is commonly called the polluter pays principle. As worker councils are charged for the damage their emissions generate, just as they're charged for using labor, natural resources, and intermediate and capital goods. It compensates the victims of pollution by giving them consumption credit for damages suffered. And most importantly, it induces victims of pollution to truthfully reveal the cost of pollution, because this mechanism is what economists call incentive compatible. So if you go back to that picture about who all is taking part in this annual planning procedure, you still have the workers' councils, you still have the consumer councils, you still have the various federations, you still have the facilitation board. But you have to add another group of actors, and they're called communities of affected parties. These are anybody who is adversely affected by a pollutant that's being emitted into the environment. Now, I don't want to claim more than I should. So here's an important caveat. Quite frankly, devising a pollution demand revealing mechanism that will use victims to truthfully reveal how much they believe pollution will damage them is not a trivial accomplishment. And as far as I know, there's no other post-capitalist model that includes it or has managed to accomplish something similar. However, this mechanism is useful only for pollutants whose effects are relatively well understood by those they damage. And most importantly, do not primarily affect future generations who cannot be present during annual planning. And obviously, there are many pollutants which don't fit this description. So what we've now done is had to move beyond this and propose how to create and revise long-run environmental plans to address pollutants which are going to affect many generations out. who cannot be present when we are discussing, approving the annual plans for a given year. So now we're going to talk a little bit about some long-run planning. First of all, long-run environmental planning. So in chapter 14 of Democratic Economic Planning, I present a concrete proposal for how to organize long-run environmental planning. To do what? We want to try and maximize popular participation by consumer and worker federations in the formulation and approval of the plan. We want to take both access to information and the motivation that participants might have into account when we're assigning the roles that they'll play. We want to induce participants to behave as what I would think of as honest brokers for future generations, recognizing they can't be present when these plans are created and approved. We use results from subsequent annual plans to identify mistakes in estimates of key parameters in the long-run environmental plans so that we can update those environmental plans and mitigate what would be avoidable welfare losses. That's a big mouthful, so I'm going to elaborate on, try and explain those various parts. Let me go through this quickly. We've now made concrete proposals for how to conduct investment planning, long-run development planning of different kinds, as well as how to integrate these planning procedures with annual planning to identify errors and assumptions. So in part 4 of Democratic Economic Planning, we explain why federations where workers and consumers are represented by delegates have to play an important role, but how investment planning can nonetheless be made as participatory, democratic, and efficient as possible. And in part 5, we take on different kinds of long-run development planning. We explain how it used to be called manpower planning. Think of it now as education planning, long-run environmental planning, long-run planning about infrastructure, and strategic international economic planning. They all face some unique problems, and we identify what they are, and we propose solutions to those challenges, still attempting to maximize participation by those most affected and achieving as efficient outcomes as possible. What's obvious about integrated long-run and short-run plans is this. As soon as we have recognized the practical necessity of creating short-run and long-run plans, then it's obvious that results from long-run plans are needed by those creating annual plans. Before you do annual planning, you need to know how much of each capital good has to be produced during the year. We need to know what resources have to be allocated to the educational system to train and teach various skills to the present and future workforce. We need to know what resources have to be allocated to environmental protection and restoration. And we need to know what industries are expanding or shrinking in order to transform an economy's comparative advantages in the international economic division of labor. So you need to know all that before you sit down and do your annual plan. Well, the answers to these questions come from the results of the various long-term plans. That's relatively straightforward, because those results from the longer-term plans requires those engaging in annual planning to accomplish certain things during the year. So long-run plans basically tell those engaging in annual planning, these things have already been decided that you're going to have to do during the year. And that's more or less straightforward and obvious. What has been less obvious is this. Results from annual planning can be used to identify mistakes in the assumptions made when longer-term plans were first created. So those longer-term plans can be revised to reduce losses of well-being. Think about this. When we're making our investment and development plans, there's no alternative to formulating, call them guesstimates. They're guesses. Guesses about what consumer preferences are going to be like in the future. guesses about what new, more productive technologies are going to become available in the future. And when you're designing good procedures for developing these plans, you have to identify who are the groups in the economy who would probably be in a situation to make the best guesses. So you want to make the best guesses you can, but you know you're going to make mistakes. It's really important if there's some way to identify that you've made a mistake in time to correct the mistake and update the long-term plan. So what we've now proposed is not only who should be tasked with formulating these guesstimates, taking both access to information and motivation into account, but when these guesstimates prove to be inaccurate, as they inevitably will be to some extent, investment and development plans are going to fail to maximize social well-being because they'll call for either too little or too much investment of different kinds. And I think our most important contribution to long-term planning is this. We've shown how you can use the results from subsequent annual planning procedures, how you can use them to identify where the errors were made in estimating future effects when investment and development plans were initially created, so those plans can then be revised to mitigate welfare losses. This is really a significant accomplishment, because once it's conceded that as a practical matter, economic planning cannot be done in one single operation covering 50 years or more, it must instead be done by several separate planning procedures covering different time periods. You have to deal with how to integrate these different planning procedures. And if you can't explain how this can be done to minimize inevitable efficiency losses, to do the inaccurate guesstimates about things that are going to happen in the future when those longer-term plans were created, then the argument against any kind of comprehensive economic planning is strengthened. So we think we've now proposed a solution, a very concrete solution to this problem. Okay, I think this is the last part. Is any of this practical? Is comprehensive economic planning practical? And certainly the consensus in the world today is it's not. People tried it in the 20th century, and it didn't turn out too well. Well, maybe they figured out what's possible. Criticisms that our proposals for replacing markets with participatory planning, that it may be nice in theory, but would nonetheless be impractical, they've taken three different forms. Some critics dismiss our proposals because they assume it is simply impossible to create what they call a detailed, comprehensive plan in the first place. For example, the Jacobin magazine dismissed our proposal as not worthy of discussion. And David Schweiker called it nonsense on stilts. So that's one sort of criticism object that's been raised that deserves an answer. Others do not dispute that a comprehensive plan can be created, but they don't believe it's possible to make adjustments in the plan quickly enough when unanticipated situations inevitably arise. Now notice that's a different objection. Now the third group has argued that while our iterative annual planning procedure may reach a feasible plan eventually, that it would take so many iterations before a feasible plan is reached that our procedure would be impractical in any real-world application. Well, those are serious things that need to be addressed. In Chapter 8 in Democratic Economic Planning, we devote a whole chapter to explaining why concerns over the level of detail stem from a misunderstanding of what a comprehensive annual plan is and what it is not. A comprehensive economic plan decides how many shoes to produce, not how many size 6 purple women's high-heeled shoes with a yellow toe to produce. That can be decided during the year based on people's purchases. We also explain a number of ways that adjustments can be made to accommodate changes in circumstances that arise during the year. Even if many historically centrally planned economies fail to deploy them. I'm not claiming that centrally planned economies do a good job in this regard. They did a pretty lousy job in this regard. So it is something that seriously needs to be addressed, but that doesn't mean it couldn't be. And we also remind readers, for all their many faults during the 20th century, centrally planned economies did function for many decades. They weren't logical impossibilities. And quite frankly, they often achieved higher economic growth rates than market-capitalist economies did. It's very easy to lose track of that in 2023. Look, we don't endorse either how those plans were created under central planning or how adjustments were made in those historic economies. But clearly, comprehensive economic planning is not a simple impossibility. How about concerns that this annual planning procedure seems just fine, but what if it takes 3,000 iterations to arrive at a feasible plan? Well, we try to address that now in Chapter 9 in Democratic Economic Planning. And frankly, I consider this a more legitimate concern. I think this is a more serious concern that needs to be addressed. We present the results in that chapter from hundreds of computer simulations of the annual participatory planning procedure for an economy with 30,000 neighborhood consumer councils, 30,000 worker councils, 100 private goods, 100 public goods, 100 capital goods, 100 categories of labor, 100 different interests from the natural environment. If you assume there's like 1,000 people in a consumer council, this would represent a population of about 30 million people, which is 3 times larger than the populations of Sweden, Austria, Portugal, or Cuba. Approximately the same size as the populations of Venezuela, Peru, Poland, Canada, or Australia, and roughly half the population of the United Kingdom, France, Italy, or Thailand. So we're not talking about a small economy. And I'll just tell you briefly what the results were. In our computer simulation experiments, it never took more than 8 iterations, that's 8 rounds of proposals and revisions, to reach a feasible plan. And on average, it took only a little more than 5 iterations. Moreover, the number of iterations required didn't increase as we increased the number of councils, the number of different kinds of goods, different kinds of labor, different inputs from nature. Now, we're the first to admit that more simulation work needs to be, and quite frankly, it is being done. We are doing it. But so far, results strongly suggest that our participatory iterative annual planning procedure cannot be dismissed as a practical impossibility, as some have done. Instead, it appears to be quite practical, as best we can tell at this point. 5 to 8 iterations is something worker and consumer councils could easily do during the month of December and have a new annual plan ready to go by January 1st. So look, after many failures, it's understandable for people to doubt democratic economic planning is possible and desirable. And it's also understandable that many anti-capitalists today will assume that we must make our peace with markets. As most anti-capitalists have done, that is the decision they've come to. So anyone who wants to argue for comprehensive democratic planning had better explain concretely and fully just how they propose it can be done. But that's what we think we've done. For over 30 years, in many books and articles, we've been tackling this task. And in these 2 most recent books, I think we've now spelled out a concrete proposal for how to create, approve, and integrate annual plans, investment plans, and various long-run development plans. I think we've explained why there's every reason to believe the results will be highly desirable. And we've responded at length to an awful lot of objections that people have raised over the past 30 years as well. So thank you. Stop there.
Thanks very much for that, Robin. Plenty of food for thought. Now we have plenty of time for question and answers. Well, if anyone has a question, please just raise your hand. I think Eric not wanting to go first, but we'll go there.
Yeah, I have a question. In the kind of organizations that you talk about and have been working on, one cliche about, let's say, capitalist management, from the, let's say we go back to Frankfurt School, you have a command economy, you can hire and fire, the boss is the authoritarian personality and so on. What is it that, do these organizations have a different code of human behavior that is non-managerial? And if so, is it just the fact that it's democratic? Or is there some kind of normative requirement, like a behavioral requirement that makes it participatory and democratic at the end of the day?
Well, I don't think any place in the talk did I really did I say anything at all about what goes on in these worker councils. I mean, how are they run and how are they different from a capitalist firm? How are they different from an enterprise in the old Soviet economy? How are they different from a workers' enterprise in the Yugoslavian economy of the 1960s and 1970s? So in the talk, I didn't talk about that. You're absolutely right. But we have talked about that, and I'll say a few things on that subject. We think one of the strongest goals of early socialists and most people today who I think are attracted to socialism is they really think workers should be able to manage themselves and not be bossed around by anyone, not be bossed around by a capitalist boss, not be bossed around by somebody that the Central Planning Board appoints to be the boss of the Soviet enterprise. Well, there are some people who think most people are not capable of engaging in self-management. They need to be bossed around by other people. They wouldn't know what to do otherwise, so they wouldn't do it. So clearly, we don't think that humans are incapable. But that doesn't mean you don't want to put a lot of careful thought into how it is that a workers' council, would self-manage. And one of the things that actually is probably the single most controversial, it's proven to be over the past 30 years, the single most controversial part of our proposal is that we have proposed that it would be very important if you want to make people capable of self-management in their workplace. It would be very important to restructure jobs. In a capitalist firm, you have a minority of jobs where all the tasks of the jobs are evaluating options and thinking about should we do this or that. And then the majority of the people in the capitalist firm are just carrying out orders. Well, is it realistic to assume that if that's the way jobs continue to be organized, that economic self-management would flourish over the down the line? We actually have a pretty interesting historical experiment that I think teaches us that we die on the line. And that's the Yugoslavian economy for over 20, 25 years. Now, I don't want to argue that Yugoslavia, fell apart because the economy was a lousy economy. The correct is actually it fell apart for very, very different reasons. But one of the things that, there are dozens of doctoral dissertations that were written on the subject of what exactly happened to participation rates in Yugoslavian worker self-managed firms over a 20-year time period. And what they all document very clearly is the interest in participation and the amount of participation diminished over time. And those who participated tended to be the managers, the people who were carrying out the managerial type tasks. And those who just got interested in something else, didn't bother to take the time to attend the meetings or care very much, were the people who were just carrying out orders. So we think that's an important piece of evidence to bear in mind. If you want, you have to equip people. You have to equip people. A part of it is, well, shouldn't this be taken care of in the education system? Isn't it important that the educational system prepare everybody to believe that I should be part of making decisions and give them the sort of the instincts and the skills to do so effectively? Of course. On the other hand, when you leave the education system, you go into a work environment, and 80% of the people in that work environment never engage in any tasks that I call empowering tasks that would give them the kind of information and give them the kind of sort of confidence to believe that, hey, I might have some good ideas about what our worker council should or shouldn't produce, or how we should go about it. So in any case, we have proposed that it would be very important, if you want an economy, if you want an economy where people really will, end up flourishing and managing their own work lives, well, then you have to take the organization of tasks into jobs seriously. You want to be sure that everybody's job has some empowering tasks in it. Now, that leaves a host of questions. Who does this? And our proposal is different workers' councils are going to come to very different decisions about exactly how to go about this. And they're going to have to decide how to do it. These jobs shouldn't be sort of structured by some outside authority that comes in and imposes them on the workers' council. We think that would be a mistake.
This is a great answer. I just want to check if anyone else wants to ask a question.
Okay. but that is something, and I'll tell you, I think that of all the things we have proposed and suggested an argument for, this is the thing that has received the most criticism from people who are in favor of the socialist alternative to capitalism.
Because?
It's inefficient.
Right.
So we've got a question from Harry.
By the way, I don't think it's inefficient, but that's what they think, and that's the major objection. Yeah.
Okay. So I think there's been a lot writing about asset manager capitalism over the past few years, and how kind of contrary to the sort of usual claims that it's kind of the anarchy of the market, you actually have these enormous multi-trillion-dollar organizations that are doing a huge amount of economic planning. The other problem is that it's not democratic. But then behind those asset management firms, you have institutional investors for whom these firms, manage their assets. They vote for company decisions based on proxy firms and stuff like that, and that's kind of how they exercise leverage over those companies. But then you also have bondholders who do it a different way, so kind of financial institutions on Wall Street, and so these are kind of the inputs that go into economic planning that we have today. And I'm just wondering, how, in your view, could those structures translate over to one that's ruled by democratic economic planning? Which ones need to die? Which ones can be restructured to kind of work with this system? What can be used and what needs just leaving to the dustbin of history, I suppose, is my question.
Okay.
Can we collect a couple of questions, or do you want to take them?
I'm going to forget this. But I can be shorter in answer.
No, that's whatever you.
Look, you're bringing up I'm going to comment briefly on what I hear as sort of 2 or 3 different things. One is, I think you just gave a fairly accurate description of the kind of neoliberal economies that we have increasingly everywhere today. And I think overall their performance is, I think their performance in terms of what they are achieving and what they are not achieving, then any sort of reasonable assessment of their performance is that that kind of an economy actually performs worse than more social democratic versions of capitalism that, from the past. So yes, that's happening. It also dispels the myth that somehow, we just have free markets deciding. No. In the context of markets, we have a tremendous amount of power being exercised. But it's not the ordinary people. It's not ordinary people exercising that power. It's increasingly it's those who are the highest in the financial elite. I'm also completely on board with people studying capitalism and saying part of what's happened is we've had the financialization of capitalism. And for the most part, that has lowered the performance in terms of growth and providing ordinary people with decent standards of living, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. One of the things that annual planning, the participants in annual planning, I think it's actually harder to figure out how to involve ordinary people in long-run development planning and investment planning than it is how to involve workers in their councils, ordinary workers and ordinary consumers in neighborhoods in creating the annual plan. And I take that seriously because if it's harder to involve ordinary people, and ordinary people have how many hundreds of years or thousands of years of feeling like it ain't worth my while getting involved and spending time trying to be involved in decision making, then that's a serious problem. And one of the things that I've written about investment in annual planning and investment in development planning is that I unfortunately I see a larger role for federations of workers' councils and federations of consumer councils. Now think about it. A federation, well, who's the federation? Well, it's going to be delegates. A federation of workers' council is going to consist of people who've been sent from individual worker councils to be delegates, at the federation. Well, that's one step removed from an ordinary person. And I think one of the things that I would encourage anybody thinking forward on these issues, and I have said so in the book, that the one thing that concerns me is that if there's any possible way to organize the investment in the long run planning in ways that, now in the end, once the plan has been created and we've involved people from representatives from this federation and that federation and making estimates of this and that, of course we think this plan should be amply debated. Political parties should say they like it or not like it, and it should be subject to a referendum and or a legislative body that's elected, etc. But that still is not ordinary people participating in drawing up these long-run plans. And I do think that that's an important thing for all of us to keep in the background and always trying to figure out ways to improve on that.
Yeah, I guess, because I cover institutional investor activity in public and private markets for my job. I'm a B2B journalist. And what I see in these massive kind of public pensions like Calvert's and stuff like that, you have in a weird way, you have kind of a blueprint for a more democratic application of resources, because these organizations are to a certain extent already governed by democratic processes, like the trustees are elected by members, and then the trustees are kind of, they're the delegates that decide, okay, who's the chief investment officer going to be, and how many people are we going to elect to, how many people are we going to hire to like the investment team and stuff like that. So I think I don't know, I'd spend a lot of my time thinking about pension funds, which is lame, but yeah, I don't know, I see it.
Somebody's got to study it, and somebody has to be writing as a journalist about it.
Yeah, but I see parallels there, or kind of something prototypical about it.
The other thing I should have said is, I'll be very brief about this. Notice that I am not talking about strategy, about how to achieve any of this. Neither of these last two books tackle the issue of strategy. How do you get there? The only thing they say is that anything that moves us more in the direction of social democracy and away from neoliberalism cannot be a bad thing, and is probably part of the necessary transition for at least the economies we think of as the advanced economies in the world. But aside from that, I very carefully, and it's simply because I think that it is a much more difficult subject, and I think it's much less subject to, there was a time when leftists thought that, experts in producing a socialist revolution, had the wisdom to know exactly what the right strategy was. But of course, they couldn't agree on that. I mean, you're reading a Trotskyist sect or a Maoist sect or a Stalinist sect. But I don't think that's a much more complicated process, and one that I have not attempted to tackle. And part of what you're talking about is, and the reason I'm mentioning that is you're saying, well, is there any part of this that would be part of a sensible strategy, a transition strategy to move in the direction of more planning like you're talking about? And that may be the case, but I think that's a whole different kettle of fish, talking about strategy and tactics.
Thank you very much.
Will's been waiting patiently.
Thanks. And I actually think it's a really interesting question about thinking about the baby steps towards getting there. But I just have 2 points. I'm very sympathetic to the project. I think it's really exciting to talk about. I guess just thinking not so much how to get from here to there, but just thinking about a couple of things. I wonder if, so given there's lots of, seeing a lot more climate related disruptions to production networks, consumption, and kind of facilitation and so on. And, I'm just wondering if in the system, if there were any accidents, disasters, breakdowns in production, we're going to need more regulate. The annual meeting is probably going to become more regular, basically. There's going to be demands on production and consumption, which can't wait, and so needs space. I just wanted to hear, I guess I haven't read the books, I don't know, but wanted to understand what you think about that, about kind of the need for kind of much more faster feedback loop, given that even if, for example, data on bits and bobs is collected locally, it will need to be expressed to demands on the production network in some sense at a much faster rate, it seems. I wondered if there's something that can kick in, or some kind of mechanism to make this annual meeting, and it might need to be. I guess the kind of shadow of the central authority can emerge, and if it does need to be more regularly, given kind of whatever contingencies might happen. And the very brief second question was really, given that there's a much, very crystallized international global production network with its history and all that kind of stuff, does this require kind of a very equal distribution of production networks? Because I'm just thinking here about if different councils have different production specializations, and some do something, some others do other stuff, what does that mean for the kind of demands people can make, and so on and so forth? I don't know if it seems like I got this idea that it's kind of equal production network distributed. So, I'll give your thoughts.
Okay. I hope you're going to think that these are answers to various things you've asked. One is that one alternative vision that's out there is, my name for it is ecolocalism. And And the idea is that the economies in the world have gotten much too centralized, and that we would be far better off if we would break the world's economies down into relatively self-sufficient local communities. And those people who sort of have that vision, they ask me about that. Well, don't you think that would be a good idea? And my answer to that is, I don't know how much decentralization and centralization would be the right answer. I'm agnostic on that subject. But what I've claimed to have come up with is a system that would find the right answer. I don't know what the right answer is. I don't know if you implemented these planning procedures, we would have a more integrated global economy than we do today, a much less globally integrated economy than we do today, or one that looks more or less the way we have. I don't know the answer to that. But I also don't think people that just have a vision have any reason to believe that they know what the right answer to that is. Second thing, early on, if you go back to 1900, the early 1920s, socialists thought that, when the socialist revolution broke out, it was gonna pretty much spread everywhere. And so they envisioned that socialist economies were going to very quickly not operate in a world, and then the Soviet Union found out very much otherwise. And then we had Stalin building socialism in one country. I think we actually have plenty of evidence to suggest how if things do move forward, that we have a lot of evidence to suggest that will happen in the following way. Some group of people disgusted with capitalism are going to manage to successfully come along and say, we want to try socialism again. Then they have to figure out, what does that mean? But they're going to also have to answer the question, well, if we start to build something we think of as a socialist economy, how do we interact with all the other economies on the planet? And the other economies on the planet, most of them are going to still be capitalist economies. Are you going to trade with them, and if so, on what sort of basis? Are you going to engage in international, investments of different kinds, and if so, on what sort of basis? And do you do that? Can you only do that with other countries that are socialist, or can you also do it with capitalist countries? And what about the fact that I don't know whether socialism is going to break out in a country that's a very underdeveloped country, or it's going to break out? Would it matter? Would it make a difference if we have a socialist country that's rather developed? Is the way they should interact with other countries, international trade and investment, should that be somewhat different from a socialist country that's very underdeveloped? So I was rather amazed. I think this is an incredibly under-discussed situation that is obviously the situation that will evolve in this century, that earlier socialists never thought about it because they didn't think they would face that situation. So there now is a chapter actually there's a chapter in both books that said, well, let's think seriously about this. And how would it be, depending on whether the country was a poor country or a richer country, how would it have to interact? What should be its strategy? Because I clearly think the answer is not, well, we're a socialist country and we can't interact with capitalist countries, we can't trade with them, that's not it, but thinking through how to go about doing that. And I actually think that any country that has a socialist economy would find it would be well served by engaging in what I call international economic planning. And that would be, but then the question is, but how does a socialist country do that that's different from how a capitalist country would So those are just a few things that have something to do with what you're asking.
We've got time for maybe one or two more questions. So go. Okay, bunch of hands up. We'll start here and then.
There's no clarifying question. What would happen to the monetary system in this? Do you still have it as we have it today, or do you move to a no monetary system where it's just a social benefit across everything, or is it something else?
In our proposal, a country that had this kind of an economy would have a currency. There'd be a currency. And, whether it was Mexico would have the peso. Whether or not a bunch of countries decided to have, the same currency, like the euro, well, that could be too. But yeah, it has a currency. People have income. The income's measured whatever the currency is. So it's not an economy where there's no money. It's not an economy where there aren't prices on things. Quite frankly, I consider those to be fantasies. A similar question to that is, well, if you have currency, that's fine. What about banks and borrowing and lending? And we have made a suggestion in answer to that, which is you clearly do not want to tell people, this year, this is your income from your fellow workers have said, they've evaluated you, and your fellow workers have said this is your income, and then if you've got, if you've got various, there could be a basic income in addition to that, there could be stipends if you were retired or disability. So you've got an income, and you go ahead and you want to consume. Well, what if you want to consume more than your income this year? Can you borrow? Can you save? And our answer is, well, of course you should be able to borrow and save. And how are you actually going to do that? There's some details, but credit unions work fine. Eventually you have to deal with what if somebody keeps borrowing, and their promise to repay just becomes not very credible. Well, that's what banks, we have a financial system that deals with that situation. Would you presumably still need some sort of system to deal with that? My answer is yes, and it can be done by credit unions. But that's the answer on just money, currency, credit unions, banks, borrowing and saving. For some people, our recommendation in those areas, well, that doesn't sound that different from today, so it must be very ugly stuff. It's part of what's ugly. For other people, they say, well, thank God they're not totally in the clouds of something so ridiculous that it couldn't possibly be something that would break. So
thank you for the talk, Robin. I would be interested to understand how you imagine the role of computation within the participatory economics that you're exploring. I ask because I suppose computation has played an important role in realizing different kinds of economic planning to be realized. Some examples being Socialism running on a network of telex machines. Nowadays, companies like Amazon setting the price and doing a method of economic planning using user data, automation. I asked because towards the end of your talk, you were mentioning some of the computer simulations and iterations that you were testing to provide a consolidated plan. So yeah, we'd just be interested to hear a bit more about how you see rural computation.
okay, we've obviously we had a huge revolution in computers And it's been followed by sort of a huge technological revolution in information management, the availability of information and manipulation and massaging of information. And I'll give you what might sound like a very, strange answer. Well, another way to put it is, the economy you're proposing, is it really only an economy that's become technologically possible because of these technological revolutions in information management? And my answer is no. The kind of economy I'm proposing could have been done back in 1840. Would it have been clunkier? Would the speed at which we need to update things? Yeah. But there's nothing in the system itself that requires this or requires. But I think a lot of what there is positive potential in this, in these technological revolutions. The danger is, the danger always is positive potential doesn't necessarily mean that's what happens. It can turn out to have tremendous negative consequences, which we're all rightly worried about right now. So that my basic answer is simply that if anything, I think it just makes things faster and easier and simpler, particularly with regards to making adjustments. Because you're going to have to make adjustments in any economy when things don't turn out the way everybody expected them to. And all of this stuff, I think, makes making those adjustments easier, faster, quicker, and more efficient than it would have been 20 years ago, than it would have been 50 years ago, yeah.